In the last video, I implemented Bearer Token Authentication using the .NET 8 identity endpoints into my end-to-end authentication module. Now I'll continue with the Bearer Token Authentication in Blazor WebAssembly. I'll start by making sure that on a page refresh, the user is still authenticated, so that returning page visitors don't have to manually log in each web app visit. After that, I will present you with two approaches to Blazor WebAssembly authentication. The first approach will be the one that Blazor provides out of the box. The second approach will be the keep it simple, stupid approach. And I'll make sure to publish both approaches to my Patreon so you can choose either one. So we have everything to make this work. Once authenticated, in the local storage we'll find our access token and refresh token, so that's all we need. So now let's say I refresh. On refresh I should get those tokens from the local storage and try to get the user info, so by calling that auth manage info endpoint. If this was successful, we know our token is still valid and we have our current user, so we are authenticated with the backend, which means we can tell our front end that we are authenticated. If it wasn't successful, that could be because our token is invalid or expired. If it's expired, we could refresh the token first. If that was successful, refreshing the token, we'll get a new access token, which we can then use to retry getting that current user. And then we know we're successfully authenticated with the backend, so we're safe to tell our frontend that we are successfully authenticated. If that fails, we're not going to try anymore. So then it's up to the user to re-authenticate manually with our web app. So in the meantime, I made this work. If I now refresh, the user gets automatically logged in. That's why you see that test@gmail.com. Refresh and you see the test@gmail.com. And in here you see the network call got made and we get a proper response. So let's now dive into the code. So this auth-state-layout is now a component you could place anywhere on the page, either on the main layout or on an individual page. So all it does is initialize the authentication state. Let's take a look at that. So init auth tokens, that's where we start with. If this is empty, we're going to get those tokens from the local storage. There still are none. Or we are already authenticated when the current user is already filled in, just not gonna continue. That means we have everything we need. Set the authentication HTTP header. So if we correctly set these auth tokens, we can then authenticate our HTTP client. So setting that HTTP client header to then initialize the current user if we don't have it already. Tries to get the user info. If it was successful, perfect. Then we just set another property in the state and we just exit the function. So let's have a look at the state. So I just added two, so auth tokens and current user, which this one holds the tokens, of course, the login response, access token, refresh token, and this one holds the email confirmed, and the claims. Let's say it wasn't successful because the token expired or it's just invalid tokens or something. Then I'm logging something, could not get current user, attempting to refresh the tokens now. So that's actually what we'll do next, is to use whatever tokens we have and try to get new ones. So refresh tokens, which will post to our endpoint with that stored refresh token from the local storage. If that for some reason failed, that might be the reason that the refresh token is invalid or expired or whatever scenario. And in that case, we actually want to clear everything. So unset auth state. So remove the current tokens from the local storage, since they're probably corrupted or expired or invalid in any way. We set all this, we clean out the state, and we unauthorize the HTTP client. If we were successful, we're going to set those tokens into the local storage and authenticate our HTTP client. Then after the refreshing of the tokens was successful, then we try again to get that user info. So we're basically just trying 2 times. Okay, so that was all the code to make sure a user re-authenticates on page refresh. But we still have a major problem, and that is only the auth state layout component now knows about this authentication state. All the rest of our application doesn't know anything about our authentication state. So for that, we could use the Microsoft official documentation pages for client-side Blazor authentication. So that's the first approach. So I start by using this builder authentication. I'm going to add that to the extensions method underneath here. And then you'll see my server-side project. So my pre-render server is complaining about adding the authorization middleware. So I'm going to do that, which is a bit unfortunate. It should be a project that can plug and play standalone modules. So now I'm adding things to my module, and then I'm adding things to my implementation project, which makes that I can't, let's say I start a new project and I add in that authentication module, it's gonna error because it doesn't have this line. And then I have to do something else. I have to add the cascading stuff in here. Let's see, components.authorization from Microsoft, newest, to the implementation project, because we're working in this app.razor. And then we need to make sure the authorization is there and the imports as well. Authorization to have these cascading authentication state. And then we could add that authorization route view that we see here. So let's add that instead of the route view, I think. Okay. And then it wants that authentication state provider for that cascading thing. So I'm gonna add that to the shared SPA of the auth module. And that one inherits from authentication state. Yeah, I need that NuGet package here as well. Or maybe only here, since the implementation project implements this one. So let's add that. And I should be able to inherit from that, implement missing members, which will be the get authentication state async. And to make this work, to get rid of that error, I think I'll have to say services.add scoped. That should resolve the issue. And of course, we don't want to throw application state. New claims principal, just like that. That would tell our application that we're unauthorized, because there's no claims in there. So let's now try this authorized view as well as the cascading auth state parameter. And I'm gonna copy over all of this as well. Let's see. And I'm gonna put the auth message underneath. Let's see what that gives. Okay, I moved it down below just to see it better. So this is you're not authorized from the not authorized view, and the auth message is not visible. So that was as I expected, because this boilerplate code does not know that we're authorized. It doesn't even know that we have the bearer token at this time. So we'll have to tell the authentication state provider that we have that info. So this is what it would look like in the custom authentication state provider. You initialize this identity, this principal, forming that user object, and pass that along as a new authentication state. And we're gonna pass that along to, and that's where it gets interesting, to an event. So it's likely that the cascading component that you saw on the app.razor, so this one, it's likely that this one listens to this event. So if we take a look at that, this invokes authentication state in changed, which is an event, which will then make sure that from the top down, that authentication state is passed as a cascading value, which then makes that I can access it on the user info page. So this one will then be updated as well. So that's pretty interesting, that event getting invoked to notify the necessary components that authentication state changed. But now we first need to find a way to get our bearer token, the claims, in this object, because only then we have successfully told our application that we are authenticated. So that code would look as follows: a custom authenticate method that now the claims identity is set to the current user's claims, but that's a dictionary. So we have to reformat that to an enumerable of claims. So, and now we should have a valid authentication state. Okay, I had to look at another example of a custom authentication state provider for Blazor server ASP.NET Core 7. What you see in here is, so they also have the custom method, but they added just a string with something in there, which apparently makes a difference. And then they injected authentication state provider as it is. So not the custom one, the actual one, but then they cast it to the custom one to access that authenticate user. Okay. So I kind of did the same authentication state provider, injected on my auth state layout, cast that to the custom state provider, and then called it authenticate, and passing along the current user data holding those claims, and add that random string. And then you see hello test@gmail.com, which comes from this. And another cool thing you could do is the attribute on the page, and you can even pass down roles like admin, and I think you separate them by comma. You can also specify the roles on one of these, so roles. And the message you saw, top level not authorized, comes from here. I added this not authorized component inside of the authorized route view. If you like that approach, I recommend you use this official documentation page of Microsoft. I'm not going to continue with this approach. I'll be using my own approach since I find this a bit much for stuff we already have and already know. It might not seem like much, but wasted hours making everything work. I have had countless error pages for some kind of middleware or not properly registered services. And I don't like the fact that I had to register services in multiple different places. After all of this setup, we still actually need to tell the application that we are authenticated by simply passing our claims. But make sure to let me know what you think about this official Blazor authentication approach. There are definitely some interesting parts about it. So the time has come for the alternative approach, and there will definitely be similarities. I'm going to start with adding an event on auth-state-change, which I then want to invoke, which is similar as the notify auth-state-change. So let's call this notify auth-state-changed. And I'm going to have to call this void. Yeah, let's make it public so I can access it in the HTTP client. I'm going to have to call this after the authentication state changed. So let's try state provider notify auth-state-changed. And also after logging in manually. So let's have a look. Login. Let's see, notify auth-state-changed. And then after refreshing, here, unset auth-state, I also want to notify that I'm no longer authenticated. And I now want my auth-state layout to listen to that event. So whenever I initialize this component, I want to start listening to that on auth-state-change event. And whenever there's a change, this method will be executed. And when I dispose of the component, I want to stop listening to that event. But this, of course, will be called whenever the user is logged in or even when the user is logged out. So at this point, we're not sure which one of it is. And if you remember from the previous approach, the way we told our application that we were authenticated was by making that claims principal the auth state by actually just passing the current user's information and claims. So we're going to do a similar thing, but just with the current user's information. If that is not null, we assume we're authenticated correctly. If it is null, we assume we're not authenticated. So I'm going to add a state property of, maybe I'm going to do it above, is logged in, and we're simply going to set that to whether the current user dot email. Is email a good thing? Yeah, you could even try the claims. Is not null or white space. And remember, when we unset the auth state, we actually clear out all of these values. So that's a good thing. So based on that property, that value, you could add some redirection logic with the navigation manager. Let's say you want everyone that accesses a certain page with this component to be authenticated. If the user is not, you might want to redirect them to the login page or another page of your choosing. Or you could even do the opposite, and when a user is authenticated, you could lead them to the admin section of your website. Let me just leave that optional. So now this auth state layout component will know whenever we're logged in or logged out, and will also know it whenever that changes while using the app. But how are we now going to tell other components that we are authenticated or not? We could use an event callback or even a render fragment. Let's start with the event callback and explore the possibilities of that. I simply added a parameter, the event callback. I pass along the bool, which is going to be is logged in, the value of that, and then the event callback, which I'm going to then invoke down below. Invoke async and pass in state provider dot is logged in. Now I can go to the user info page and the auth layouts and use that event callback on auth state changed, and then do something whenever that auth state changed. Let's see if we can directly have the is logged in. And I simply pass along a method to log this, whether we're authenticated or not, and I changed this console.writeLine.authStateLayout plus is logged in. Gonna clean that up a bit, and let's see if that works. And running that gives us auth-state-layout true and user info page true. But note, we're still not seeing any changes on this page, so still the not authenticated, and still we're not seeing the user info or the claims. And that's because, this user info layout is not being re-rendered. The responsibility of this auth state layout is simply to tell us whether we're authenticated or not. We're not going to add any logic in here to say if we are logged in, do this and that or that. We could, like I mentioned before, we could add in the redirect logic. But let's make some other components for actually adding conditional statements depending on that authentication. So I simply made another component, AuthorizedLayout this time, which uses this auth state layout and uses the event callback as well. And I customized the console.writeLine to tell me that we're also, I am going to add a property, has access, and I'm going to add an if statement, has access, and then I need only when access was approved, I want to show the child content. And I'm going to add another property, a parameter, required policy, which is basically going to allow the implementer to pass a method that is not yet invoked, and we can invoke it in here, and a method that should return a boolean. So for example, has administrator access. So I'm going to set that property has access based on the required policy, If it's null, it means we don't require any extra roles or permissions. But if there was a policy passed along, then I invoke it. So this could be has administrator access, then that gets invoked, and that will check whether that user actually has admin access. But let's not worry about this required policy yet. Again, here you could add optional logic that says this would be navigation manager if you inject it. And then you could say navigate away or whatever. So if you don't have access, you could redirect out of there. And otherwise you'll see this h2 no access. So either you get redirected out or the content gets replaced by no access. And we could pass along that event callback simply to re-render when we need to. So that would look as follows, and then I make this async task. And I'm simply adding a console log statement just for debugging purposes. And now let's go to the user info page and actually try it by doing authorized layout and adding that in there. So if we take a look at the demo, if I refresh, I saw the no access, and then suddenly we have access. Perfect. And now for this required policy, I made a simple function, just as an example, has admin access. Let's just set that to false for now. And then we see the no access because of that if statement. Or we could have been redirected out of this page because we might not want an unauthorized user to be even on this page. Of course, instead of that dummy return true or false, we'd actually want to maybe check whether the user has certain roles or certain permissions or certain claims. But I will keep that for a future video. Of course, we don't necessarily have to wrap the user layout. We could wrap the whole page if we wanted to. Like that. That is just fine as well. And we don't actually need both the auth state layout and the authorized layout, since this authorized layout already calls that auth state layout. So without this required policy, this component only checks whether the user is logged in. With a required policy, it could do an additional check on a requirement. So this component can actually serve as the authorized view, unauthorized view from out-of-the-box Blazor. But it can also serve as the attribute on the page. If you rather make an attribute, you could probably make a custom attribute similarly as this component. And if you'd want an unauthorized view, I think you have enough to do that as well. I could probably make this component better. Do it like that. I can add this tag now, authorized content, and that works. And then I could actually add unauthorized content and say just like that. That would be useful if you don't redirect the user out and you want to have something else than the no access. And why I actually just did that is because I want this logout button at the top. So in my auth nav menu, I can then do the authorized layout And then when I'm authorized, then I display the logout layout, and otherwise I display the login and register buttons. I moved that to a separate component because that's calling that internal auth HTTP client, and I made a logout method which basically just unsets the auth state. It actually doesn't really make sense to have these methods on the HTTP client, although this auth header, but also these local storage ones, maybe I should move those to the state. I introduced some bugs. I'm sorry for the people who were typing along. So this AND operator changes to an OR. And then in the login method, I forgot to, or this disappeared to store the authentication tokens. And I improved the code by now, so that will be available on Patreon. And also in here, an important one is logged in, had to be checked, of course, included in the check, because otherwise unauthenticated people could have had access. The improved project will be available on Patreon. So I'm going to continue with this approach, since this is for me a lot simpler. And it's contained to this authentication module, which is a requirement for my project. I don't need to have code all over my project for this to work. It's a bit reinventing the wheel, but in a much simpler way, maybe a bit less flexible. By that I mean this might fit all my requirements, all my needs. I have tested this on multiple of my own applications, and that's sufficient for me. For someone else, maybe that's not enough. Maybe it needs to be more like the out-of-the-box Blazor way. I have already made a video about authentication in Blazor WebAssembly, and with this approach, and in that video I go more in depth about those role-based authorization functionality with that required policy. So I'll leave a link down below so you can watch that if you're interested. Let me know what you think about the out-of-the-box Blazor approach, and then you may also let me know what you think about my approach. I'll make sure to publish both approaches to my Patreon, so don't forget to check that. In the next video I'll go more in depth into authorization, but this time it won't be role-based authorization, so make sure to subscribe to stay tuned. And if this video was valuable, hit that like button, and I hope I see you in the next one.